Everywhere you go now, you're watched. You probably know that. You may not know that there's about 40 video cameras here at church. You can look around and see where they are. They're recording you. We can go into one of the secretary's offices and watch you 3 weeks later and know what was going on around here. You saw the drones this week from Mexico Beach, Florida, flying over the devastation. If you saw the before and after pictures, wherever you go, you're probably on camera. And that makes for a tougher life, doesn't it? Because we're already critical of each other if we're not careful, and being on camera makes it a little bit worse. Social media has exacerbated it all, and that which used to be sort of a part-time hobby of judging has become a full-time avocation for some. In fact, for many of us, if I'm not careful, it's easy for me to judge somebody else. I want to take a poll this morning. How many of you have ever been on a jury? If you've been on a jury, raise your hands. Good gracious, a bunch of you. I think there may have been more in first service on juries. Thank God I've not been on one yet. I'm sure as soon as I say that, I'll get the call right away. But I've never had to decide, make those decisions, but that's not kept me from being a judge. In fact, I'm a judge way too often. I don't know about you, but I'm quick to look at somebody else. And Jesus seems to think that might be a problem. So in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7, his inaugural sermon, if you will, he takes time right in the middle of it to talk about what I call the respectable sin of judging. This may be the one that religious folks are most susceptible to. So look with me at what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, beginning with verse 1. Do not be judged, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you'll be judged, and with the same measure you use, it'll be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So in everything do to others what you'd have them to do, for this sums up the law and the prophets. American history used to celebrate heroes. But in our time, it seems we do our best to cut them down to size and maybe even destroy them. And so we have been conditioned to remember our leaders not for their successes, but for their frailties and failures. The presidents of my lifetime are probably remembered as much, if not more, for the things they did wrong than the things they did right. So John Kennedy is remembered more for Marilyn Monroe than facing down the Russians in Cuba. Lyndon Johnson is remembered more for his failure in Vietnam than his success in bringing help in alleviating poverty. Richard Nixon, of course, is known a whole lot more for Watergate than he is opening the doors to China. Jimmy Carter is remembered by many for the failure in Iran more than his wonderful work for Habitat for Humanity. And it goes on and on and on. Someone has written, a critic will always find what he's looking for. I want you to hear that again. A critic will always find what he's looking for. And if I put my name there as the critic, I find that's quite often true. And Jesus said, don't do it. If you look back at verse 1, it says, it's not even, please don't judge. It's not, maybe you shouldn't judge. Look at what it says, do not judge. It's imperative. If you're an English teacher, don't do it. Why did he say that? I want you to know that in Judaism in his day, there were 6 great virtues. 6 great virtues that were said to bring credit in this world and the next. And I want you to see what they were, because I think they're instructive as we look at the ministry of Jesus to see how that ministry developed out of his raising in the synagogue. So the first one is study. The first great virtue of Judaism was to study. Now, do you remember when Jesus goes home to Nazareth? He goes to the synagogue as was his custom, and he opens the scroll from Isaiah. It's a scroll he had been learning all his life. Paul says, I was taught by Gamaliel, one of the great teachers of his day. To study was one of the great opportunities to learn about the works of God. Second, visiting the sick. Now, if you're listening, you're going to know that every one of these echoes in the ministry of Jesus. Visiting the sick in Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46, he tells that amazing parable we call the parable of the sheep and the goats. You remember that? Where we're told who will inherit God's kingdom and who will be left out. And one of the things is what? You cared for me when I was sick. Or you didn't care for me. Notice 2 virtues right there followed in the ministry of Jesus. Third one, hospitality. Now, they didn't have a Hampton Inn at every exit. So what you're doing is, if you're traveling from Bethlehem to Jericho, you might ask around, you got any cousins in Jericho? Got a place I can stay? You remember the parable Jesus tells about the power of prayer? Remember, a man knocks on the door at night. I've got company showed up and I don't have any bread. You got any bread I can borrow? Hospitality. Reflected in the life of Jesus. Fourth thing I want you to see, devotion in prayer. Now, if you're watching these, I hope you're seeing how every one of them Jesus just grew up immersed in these virtues of Judaism, and they're reflected in the Gospels. Fifth, the education of children in the law. That goes all the way back. Remember, tie them on your arm. Put them on your forehead. Remember the teachings of Scripture. And 6, this is the one that's a little surprising, thinking the best of others. Quite often, if you ask people outside the fellowship of believers, they might think we think the worst of everybody else. If you watch some people espousing to be preachers, they do more condemning than anything else. But look at that. One of the great virtues that Jesus learned, this is one of the things he learned at that synagogue in Nazareth, is thinking the best of other people. You notice how many times he gave people second, third, and fourth chances. He stands by the well in Samaria, a place his folks didn't even go, and he talks to a woman who is living a life that is so far from God, but he sits down and engages her in conversation. And he tells her everything she ever did. And she leaves that place that day aware of the presence of God. You see, when we start thinking the worst of others, we may think we know what they ought to be doing all the time. If we're not careful, we become their judges. And that, taken to an extreme in Islam, that becomes terrorism. And the other person is not a human being, they are Satan. Do you see what I mean? You see the extent this can go to if we're not careful. So, what does Jesus say we ought to do about it? What does this business about not judging mean? I want to give you 4 ideas. The first idea about not judging is this. We can't judge because we never know the entirety of another person's life. One of the things that I discover is how little I know about people. And it's something I wish I knew more. I get to know people a lot of times when it's too late. When I'm sitting down with a family planning a funeral, and they'll start telling me, tell me about your friend, your loved one. And they start telling me stories. I think, I wish I'd have known that. I wish I'd known to talk to them about that. And I like to get to know stories. You know where I hear most stories? In the hospital. I go to the hospital to visit, and people just start telling their stories. Y'all remember Hal Miller in our church, sat right back on the back row back there. When Hal was in the hospital the last year, 18 months of his life, I would make it a habit to go to the hospital the last thing I did during the day, because I wanted to block out an hour to sit and talk to Hal. If you don't know who I'm talking about, he was a great football player at Dobyns-Bennett and a great football player at Georgia Tech, and he went on to the San Francisco 49ers. And he was a gentle giant. And if you didn't know Hal was an All-American, you wouldn't know from talking to him. You had to pull it out of him. And I'd go over and I'd say, Hal, tell me about Bobby Dodd, a Kingsport legend, the coach at Georgia Tech. Tell me about Bobby Dodd. I had a deacon in Gatlinburg who was Bobby Dodd's backup at UT in 1929, 1930, and 1931. Tell me, and Hal would tell me about Bobby Dodd for 15 or 20 minutes. I said, tell me about playing for the 49ers. What was that like to play in the NFL? It wasn't much. He'd tell me, and I don't know if you remember, but the day of his memorial service, if you were here, there were pictures right over here. Phyllis brought pictures. And there was a picture of him with Bob Hope. Bob Hope. If you're too old, but too young to know who that is, it was a big guy. Bob Hope, the President of the United States, Miss America, pictures right over there. I said, Hal, what was it like to be on the Bob Hope show? That was nice. That was nice. And you know, if I'd been on the Bob Hope show, I would have had a t-shirt. I was on the Bob Hope show. I stood next to Miss America. You know what I mean? But you get to know. You don't know. You and I don't know enough of another person's story to judge them. We don't know what they've endured. You remember in Forrest Gump? Anybody ever see Forrest Gump? You remember Jenny and the abuse she faced with her dad? Remember that? And you remember when she goes back home and she starts throwing rocks at that house where she had been abused. And Forrest says, sometimes there just aren't enough rocks. You know, there are people that you may not know who just needed a few more rocks. Second thing I want you to see. We can't judge others because we can't be impartial. The Greeks, you remember the statue of Justice being blind? You remember that with the scarf over the face? The Greeks would oftentimes do trials in the dark because they didn't want the appearance of the accused or the plaintiff to influence judging. It's impossible. It is impossible for us to be completely impartial. Third thing I want you to see with me. None of us is equipped to judge another person spiritually. John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11, tell one of the great stories that Jesus ever told. I want you to look at it with John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, just outside Jerusalem. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down and began to teach them. And the teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say? They were using this question in order to trap him, in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first one to throw a stone at her." And again he stooped and wrote on the ground. And at this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. And Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir." "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." I want you to think about the people you encounter this week. You and I will encounter this week who have no connection to faith whatsoever. An increasing number of people in our society. I want you to imagine you encounter some people who have no connection to a faith community. Do you think they would be more likely to someday be open to a group of people who are compassionate and caring, or angry and judgmental? Which leads us to the fourth thing. In verse 12 of Matthew 7, Jesus reminds us, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." And in verse 2 he says, guess what? The same degree you use to judge others will be used on you. I was 17 or 18 years old. I was on the way to youth choir practice. Sunday afternoon, 5 o'clock, in Charlotte, North Carolina. Driving by myself, running late for youth choir practice. I might not have stopped completely at a stop sign. Doesn't that sound a lot less problematic than running a stop sign? I didn't completely stop. In fact, the language I would later use was that I eased through the stop sign. The Charlotte police did not look favorably upon my excuse, nor the fact that I was on the way to youth choir. So I ended up with a citation to go to traffic court downtown. But nobody knew. I could keep it to myself. Except I had this friend who was a veteran of traffic court. He'd been lots of times. So I got to choir and I said, "Hey, Chris, I got to talk to you after choir." "What's up?" Chris drove a Mercury Cougar that was green. Like I said, he's a veteran of traffic court. I said, "Chris, how am I going to get out of this?" He said, "Go up, and when they ask your plea, say guilty with a plea for mercy." He said, "Use those exact words. They've worked before." So I go to court, and there's this very nice lady judge. I thought, maybe I got a shot at this. I don't know. My turn came up. She asked the arresting officer, the citing officer, I guess I wasn't arresting. She asked the officer, "What did he do?" "He ran a red light, or stop sign rather." Notice he didn't say ease through. He ran. He was kind of judgmental. She looked at me and she said, "How do you plead?" Now, this is one of those moments where I'd like to tell you I sounded like John Wayne. But I didn't. I sounded kind of like this. "Guilty with a plea for mercy." And she looked at me and she said, "Don't run any more stop signs." I said, "Okay, thank you very much." Jesus looks at that woman and says, "Who is left to condemn you?" And it's just him and her. And she looks up. She must have seen something in his eyes because she says, there's no one left to condemn me except the only one who had the right. It seems to me that maybe she was saying, I'm guilty, with a plea for mercy. And he gave it to her. I want you to know, he didn't say, go run more stop signs. He said, don't run any more stop signs. Leave your life of sin. But he said, go. There is a world beyond that you will encounter this week wherever you shop or work or play that has in their minds that all religious people are going to be there to judge them. What kind of a wonderful surprise would it be if in you and me they discovered somebody who gave them mercy instead?